These are the lectionary texts that congregations that deploy the lectionary will be utilizing in worship on February the 11th, which this year is Transfiguration Sunday. It's coming a little earlier than usual because following right on the heels of Transfiguration is the period we know of as Lent that leads us into Easter, and Easter is very early this year at the end of March, where we usually have it in April. So Transfiguration has jumped on us a little bit early this year, and the Transfiguration text we'll be using a little bit later in our video today is the one from the Gospel of Mark. There are some interesting similarities, though, or interesting connections between the texts today that are worth our talking about just a little bit. Our first text comes from 2 Kings, the second chapter, the first 12 verses, and it is the story of Elijah going to heaven. Elijah did not die. He was transported into heaven on a fiery chariot, as the story goes in 2 Kings. So that already makes it mysterious in a similar way that the Transfiguration is mysterious. But I want to go through this story with Elijah just a little bit. It seems as though it takes a fairly short time. There are several places after Elijah has called Elisha to take Elijah's place once he is gone. It seems as though this 12 verses takes place in the period of a day, because every place they stop, there are prophets there who remind Elisha that this is, and the word they tend to use is, this is the day, or this is the last day of Elijah. And Elisha continues to say, I know it, be quiet. You know, that's not what he wants to focus on. But what is interesting to do is to take the list of the several places that are in these 12 verses and look at a map geographically. And you're going to see that this did not take place over a period of a single day. It took place over a period of several days. Another thing that about it, if you plot them on a map, you may recognize that these are places that have a great deal of significance in the original settling of the land of Canaan when the Israelites come over. For example, Gilgal, that's the place they first camped out once they crossed the Jordan River. The Jordan River is also in this 12 verses. Jericho is mentioned. That's the first place they conquered on the other side, the west side of the Jordan River. So if you look at those places, you'll see this is not a day trip. This is kind of another look at the whole of the land of Israel, the whole of the land of promise. So that tells us something here, that there is something legendary in this text, something that our writer sees as kind of a summation or a heads up about direction, and that leaves it a little bit mysterious. The thing that I have tended to focus on is not noticing how there are similarities in the mystery with the Transfiguration, but on what Elisha asks for when Elijah says, you know, what would you like from me? And he says, a double portion of your spirit. But that sets us up for the most mysterious part of the text. For Elijah says, if you see me when I'm being transported into heaven, then you're going to get that double portion. And of course, Elisha does. He's practically dumbfounded. He calls out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. My father is an honorary title for someone who is older, wiser, and more experienced, which of course Elijah was. The chariots of Israel and its horsemen, you may find a few different things in the commentaries about that. Is this an image of warfare? Is this an image of Elijah's supremacy above the powers of Israel? It's kind of difficult to see, but note that this is something that nobody else is experiencing, and that Elijah was not even certain that Elisha would encounter this thing from beyond, this thing of the other world, the next world. But he does, which is a hint of something that will happen later when we look today in the Transfiguration. But it's also a hint of this middle ground in which we believers live, living the full experience of this life in the flesh and blood, and knowing that there is another life to come, which is not quite this life of flesh and blood, but we can't quite put a finger on it. So let's hold that in place for both the Transfiguration text and the one that comes to us from 2 Corinthians. Our psalm is Psalm 50, the first 6 verses. And if our psalm has anything of the here and now and the mysterious, it is in the 3 attributes or the 3 names given to God right in the beginning that they don't really come across in the English. The first one where it says the mighty one in English is really El, E-L, we would spell it El, which means the mighty one. So that's an attribute and a name for God, El. Then it says Elohim, which is a plural for gods, but it is used in the singular. And why? Just in the same way it's used in Genesis chapter 1. God is so undefinable that while God is a singular, a one, at the same time, you can't quite put a finger on God, the same way that we can touch another human being and identify another human being by voice, by color, by shape, by mannerisms. Can't quite do that with Elohim because his attributes are too undefinable. And then the last is Yahweh. So what we have here, the mighty one, God the Lord, God Yahweh. And Yahweh is the one that's up close, that we can touch, that who walks with us, that we have a much more sense of intimacy with that one. So the transcendent one, Elohim, the up close one, Yahweh, and the mighty one. So these 3 attributes, which in their own way are probably the best way we can talk about God as one who is both up close, undefinable, and too powerful for us to comprehend. The purpose of this psalm, though, is it's a call to confession. And in the first 6 verses, the priest is summoning the heavens and the earth to serve as the judges against the people. The heavens and earth being those things that God created first, that have always been around, and people like grass wither and blow away, and then a next generation comes, and so forth and so on. So the first 6 verses, which are all we have today, are this summons to judgment, this call on heavens and earth to be the judge and to remind the people that they are now standing before a righteous God who will deliver the judgment. So that sense of the mysterious on the one hand, but also on the other of a personal reckoning of ours on the other. And that is always very up close and touchable, is it not? Because we typically have a pretty good sense of where we fall short of God's glory. The next text is 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter. And to put this in the proper context, Paul has been accused of not preaching the gospel very effectively or very clearly, or maybe blurring what the gospel is really about, which is interesting, isn't it? Because you and I never think of Paul in those terms. But there were those in the church in Corinth that clearly were saying that. But what Paul does in talking about the gospel here, he alludes to the fact that the gospel is being conveyed through flesh and blood human beings. That the mysteries and the good news, which are all a part of the whole of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, are still being shared and talked about by people who, well, are vessels of clay. And so this is Paul's way of attempting to explain why there are times that the gospel may not be clear. And I would add to that about Paul. If you look at Paul's approach to conveying the gospel, which to me comes out very clearly in the book of Acts, Paul adjusts not the truth, not the message, but the mechanism, the delivery, the framing around the gospel based on who the people are that he is trying to speak to. In the same way, easiest way to talk about it for us, I think, in the same way that we talk to children about serious things at one level and adults about those same serious things in another way. And so Paul, not to consider the different cultures that he preached to be like children, but they're all different. And so he uses terms in different cultures to the best of his earthly, human, flesh and blood ability to convey the one true gospel. Still, somebody in 2 Corinthians in the church in Corinth didn't like that. And he's trying to explain in these texts about conveying the gospel. And he explains it much further than the 4 verses that we read today. But that's sort of the setup that you might say in brief, he's saying, look, we are sharing eternity on this side of eternity without us all being able to get a glimpse into what will come and in its magnificence and in its mystery. But we're doing the best we can, and that may be a good way to talk about what he's attempting to explain here. Now, speaking of mystery, the gospel, Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. A couple of words about the gospel of Mark. There are those that consider the transfiguration to be the high mark of the gospel. There are others that consider the high mark to have come just before this in Mark 6, right at the end, where Jesus is alone with his disciples, all 12, and he says, who do people say that I am? And somebody says, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist. Yeah, but who do you say that I am? And then Peter blurts out, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, which is that moment of pure recognition that gets obliterated in the next moment. For as soon as Jesus says, you're right, and I've got to suffer and many things and die, and Peter says, no, that's not right. And where it says, and Peter rebuked him, the best Greek interpretation of that is say Peter grabbed it. Well, I'll make it in an English way that we can understand. Peter grabbed him by the lapels and shook him. And that, in other words, you can't say that. That's not right. Don't tell us that. And then Jesus responds with the same kind of grabbing him up by the lapels and says, get behind me, Satan. So here we have, in just a couple of verses, a true sense from the disciple Peter of exactly who this flesh and blood man they have been following around, who he is. And then in the next instant, Peter is saying, don't confuse me with all the mystery. Just let me hang on to what I want to hang on to, which is if you're the Messiah, nothing bad's going to happen to you. It kind of reminds us of who we are, and reminds us again of where Paul is coming from with being a deliverer of the gospel who is a flesh and blood human who only gets his own dim glimpse into that other world which is yet to be completely fulfilled. You probably always wonder, why is it that Jesus sees and converses with Moses and Elijah. Well, I can't tell you the exact why, but let's think of who Moses is, that early redeemer of the people out of slavery. We could put that same mantle on Jesus as the redeemer of all God's people from slavery to sin. Elijah is always seen as a forerunner of the full fruition of God's kingdom. And so we have a redeemer and a forerunner who are right there conversing with Jesus. Now, back to the disciples, they're just aghast at what they see. They have had this glimpse into the world that is to come, a world that they're not prepared as flesh and blood humans, neither would we be, to catch a glimpse of that and fully embrace it. Even going back to the Psalm, any more than we can fully embrace who God is outside of Jesus. And so the attributes of Mighty One, Elohim, and Yahweh all fit to give us a way to handle what we really can't handle. And so the disciples see this with Jesus. They hear the voice of God speaking. They really don't know quite what to do with this. And then Peter says, let's build some tents, one for you, one for Elijah, one for Moses, and let's just hang up here in this unbelievably amazing moment in time. And Jesus basically says, nope, we got to get down the mountain and get busy back with what we're about. And back with what they're about includes Jesus saying to the disciples, don't tell anybody about this until after my death. In other words, this would serve only to confuse. It would not do anything to empower the people to understand who I am. I think that's a pretty good place for us to leave it for today, is this hanging on to these two worlds, our world of flesh and blood in which we encounter the Christ, and the world that is to come, which is spirit, that we know by faith, but we can't quite embrace it in the same way that we can embrace the sunshine and the wind and our brothers and sisters in Christ and our families and our day-to-day encounters in work and every other thing that we encounter. This is where we live as the people of God, this flesh and blood world in anticipation of the world that God has promised. I'll see you next week.